webinar we've conducted. The first webinar was on social norm theory, and this webinar will be followed by another webinar on scaling up social norms interventions. I wanted to talk a little bit about the goal of the Learning Collaborative. The Learning Collaborative really was established and funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to facilitate collaborations between organizations who are working in the adolescent sexual reproductive health space, really with the goal of building knowledge and developing shared tools to advance social norm measurement, design, measurement theory, and scale up. The Learning Collaborative was led by a steering committee and supported by IRH, as the secretariat of the Learning Collaborative was FHI 360, and I think supporting IRH. And I think you all can agree that the Learning Collaborative was in fact a success. The Learning Collaborative has 370 members from 108 different organizations, with the measurement community specifically having 103 members. Next slide. The measurement community, during its 2 years that we were working, produced 3 practical guides related to measurement. The first was the Social Norms Exploration Guide, that was designed for practitioners to understand what existing social norms are, how they might be influencing behavior, and what individuals were influencing the norms and the behavior. The second thing that we developed was a map that you can see here on the right, which displays ongoing social norm projects that have addressed social norms and how they have measured social norms within these projects. So if you go to the map to the right and you click on something, you'll get a very nice description of a project working to move social norms, as well as the measurement approaches they were using. The third tool that we developed was entitled, really a guide for practitioners seeking to measure social norms in their programs. Next slide. All of these materials that I just talked about, and all the materials from the Learning Collaborative, are available on the Align platform, which is listed here. And the Align platform is housed by the Overseas Development Institute, whose goal is to showcase work on gender and social norms. So moving back to the practical guide that we developed under the measurement community. Well, why did we really develop this? I mean, I think we wanted to demystify social norms measurement. We wanted to capture a diversity and display a diversity of approaches and tools being used. We wanted to compare and clarify tools and approaches, and really we wanted to provide guidance to practitioners. And how did we develop this guide? This is the approach we've used, and a similar approach was used across all the communities with this really explicit focus on collaboration. But for here, we started with consultation with experts in the social norm field to figure out what tools could be useful to develop a vision for the practical guide. We solicited tools and measurement strategies from the LC community members and their peer networks. We then reviewed resources and received and we reviewed the resources we received, and we conducted in-depth interviews with those who submitted them. And some of these tools and approaches are highlighted in our practical guide. The guide, we also realized in developing guide that programs have different social norm measurement needs depending upon where they are in the program cycle. We adapted our framing strategy, was adapted based on something that Lori Heisey and Ben Cheslagi had developed originally. The first step in our guide really talks about exploring what the social norms are. And this section really focuses on how to diagnose social norms that are in play in your programs. The next section is called Define and Align. And this section really talks about the importance of theories of change and conceptual models to figure out how social norms are at play in the milieu of other things that are in play in affecting behavior. The next section is called Measure, and this section really displays, and we're going to hear about some of these today in our talk, some of the measurement tools that have been used in programs. And the last section of our guide is called Understand and Act, which provides guidance and consideration for program implementers in the field. Next slide. So what do we hope you learned today? Well, I'm hoping everybody goes away with some sort of understanding of what the current thinking on social norm measurement is and the advancement that we have made as a learning collaborative. And we really want to encourage, well, we also want to make sure that you understand about this tool and how it can be used to help your programs. So today we're going to have 4 presenters. The presenters are going to go sequentially. We're going to leave about 30 minutes for Q&A at the end of all the presentations. But as the presentations are ongoing, please put any questions you have in the chat box, and we'll get to as many of them as we can at the end. So now I have the pleasure to introduce Anne Sprinkle from CARE, Carrie Jo Clark from Emory, Suruchi Sood from Drexel University, and Vincent Petit from UNICEF. So over to you, Anne.
Thanks so much. While I request to put my slides up and get control, I just want to say a really quick thanks to the Learning Collaborative for hosting us. I agree, been really successful, and yeah, just personally and professionally, and for the organization, CARE has really benefited from being a part of these groups. So thanks so much. I am now controlling the screen. I guess we just need to get my slide up. Is that right, Monica?
Yes.
Cool. So I'm going to be talking today about how we in the Tipping Point Initiative utilized, I need to press the present slide as well. Great. Okay. How we talk, how the Tipping Point Initiative has utilized CARE's social norms analysis plot framework to measure social norms. I'm mainly going to talk about our phase 2 baseline study that we did recently. So just to kick us off with some basics, what is a social norm? Social norms are, just simply put, unspoken rules of behavior. They're made up of 2 kinds of expectations. First, what I think others do, which is called a descriptive norm or an empirical expectation, and then what I believe other people think that I should do, also called an injunctive norm or a normative expectation. In other words, people's behavior depends on their expectations about other people's behavior and their approval. So when it comes to norm setting, sorry, just go back to this slide. So when it comes to norm setting, just a quick plug for reference groups. We're not just talking about any other people's behavior or any people's approval, but we are talking about who people who matter to us, who influence our own behavior, also called people in our reference group. So just a quick primer on some of the things we'll be talking about today. And so in 2015, CARE created the SNAP framework in Ethiopia and piloted it in a few places to guide the development and analysis of qualitative vignettes to measure norms change. When we started, the literature really focused on identifying whether a certain social norm existed, but as practitioners, we really wanted to go beyond just diagnosing norms to understand how they're changing. The SNAP framework is a framework to measure key components of social norms that we think might show change or tell us about a strength of a given norm. SNAP has mostly been used for vignettes that I'll talk about today as an analysis framework, but it can and has been used to develop other kinds of tools as well. So we've developed a norm by norm focus group discussion guide that's a bit simpler and more streamlined. I won't be able to go over that today, but I could certainly connect people to resources for another example. But the key here is that the aim is to distill and apply key elements from social norms theory into our program M&E tools. So the SAT framework, like I said, developed and piloted in Ethiopia a couple of years ago, but since then it's been used in over 12 countries and by a couple of different organizations. And we use the framework to understand signs of strengths or weaknesses, also what we call cracks in norms. And because social norms change is a process, and will likely only show the process of change within our project cycles, we wanted to develop a way to identify and understand the markers of change and the change process for our programming. So the first three components you see up top, empirical expectations, normative expectations, and sanctions. We look to identify or verify if respondents agree that the norm we identified in our formative research actually exists. Then we added two more components at the bottom that we thought would tell us about the nature of the norm. Sensitivity to sanctions, which is what we thought would tell us about the link between the norm and behavior. That is, if there are social sanctions, do they matter for behavior? Do they influence behavior of people in the vignettes that we use? We also added expectations. So we wanted to understand what circumstances are considered acceptable to deviate from the norm, to see if this offered us insights about how we could leverage activities and programming. So we wanted to see if we could like widen cracks, if you will. So just to give you a little bit of background about the Tipping Point Initiative, because I'm going to use examples, like I said, from our phase 2 baseline, and I can talk a little bit about how our programming responds to the measurement tools as well. Tipping Point is a multi-country initiative addressing child marriage by focusing on its root causes. We see child marriage as an act of violence, so we enable girls to assert their rights, help families and communities to support them, and influence policy to sustain change. So we have community level programming in Bangladesh and Nepal. You can see that on the right. We do evidence generation. For phase 2, we have a 3-arm cluster RCT in both countries, and multi-level advocacy and influencing. Just a note about Tipping Point, at the beginning of phase 1, you can see that 2013 to 2017, we did deep, thorough formative research and analysis. We called this the community participatory analysis. We wanted to understand the vulnerability to child marriage and its drivers in really contextually specific regions of Nepal and Bangladesh. And you can see the social norms under key norms there. Sorry, they're a bit small, but some of our key interventions address these among other factors. So I'll use some of these as examples, but most of these relate back to the issue of family honor. And they're formulated as social norms related to adolescent girls' behavior or actions. But it's really important to note that there are also social norms influencing parents' behavior in terms of how they restrict adolescent girls' mobility, interaction with boys, etc., as a way, again, to conserve family honor. So there's a lot on this screen, so I'll just intro and vignettes and then walk you through this example. Vignettes, as you can tell, show a short fictional story, and we want to display the social norm and then ask questions about its characteristics or components that I went over in the SNAP framework. Again, this helps us understand people's perceptions about others, not their individual or actual behavior. So once we develop these vignettes, we usually do it in coordination with program staff and our MELA research staff. And then we use the vignettes within focus group discussions in homogeneous groups to understand further the specific perspectives of key groups. This vignette here is focused on decision-making around early marriage. Just a quick shout out to Emory, our research partner in Nepal, and their local partner IDA. I'll be using our Nepal examples, and I'm sure Carrie can talk more to that later on if you'd like. So I'll read the story that calls forth the norm. The first part of the story is summoning up a situation when a norm would come into effect. So Saleha is 16, she dropped out from school, lives with her parents and sisters. One day a matchmaker came to her parents with a marriage proposal for Saleha. She and her family came to know from the matchmaker that one of Saleha's former classmates, Rita, is already engaged and is getting married in a week. The matchmaker suggested that Saleha needs to get married too, she is getting older. She also mentioned that she has a perfect proposal for her. She gave the details of the potential bridegroom, and Saleha's parents were pleased with his background and asked the matchmaker to invite the potential bridegroom to their house for seeing Saleha. So this first question of the vignette guide is focused on what normal people would do or expect them to do. You can see that here on number 1 with its probe. And then the story continues to show Saleha define that norm. Now, the pieces of question 2 that you see below mirror the final components of the SNAP framework. So A is the sensitivity to sanctions that Saleha would experience in that situation. B is a sensitivity to those sanctions that are brought up by respondents. The question specifically on sensitivity to sanctions is our attempt to link the norm to behavior. So for instance, is it strong enough to make the main character, Saleha, to act in a certain way or conform with the norm? And we think that this makes SNAP unique. We try to uncover if the norm matters. Is it strong enough to influence behavior? Can you go against that norm? This is really important for program strategies and activities for us, specifically during design. And implementation, obviously, as well. And then finally, C opens the door to discuss possible exceptions over time if they're expanding, weakening, and then we can know if the norm is weakening as well. So here are some sample respondents or girls' responses coded by different components of the SNAP framework. In the empirical expectations response up top, you can see a girl is reflecting on what she thinks parents should do. But in the normative expectations response, you can see her reflecting on what girls are expected to do. Below that, the sanction is described. Backbiting is a sanction. And below that, you can see how sensitive respondents are to the sanctions. There's an immediate response to restrict girls' mobility due to that sanction. And that shows us that there's really high sensitivity to the sanction. And then finally, you can see where there's an opening for this norm to weaken if the proposal is bad. There are instances where it's acceptable to go against the norm. And then this slide helps you understand how to interrogate the data to figure out, so what? How do we use this for programming? So for instance, has agreement changed about what is considered to be typical and appropriate? So if baseline, if everybody is on the same page, but inline they're not, or it's differing by group. So for instance, if men think something is really typical, women don't, that's really interesting for us. We see something shifting there. Then thinking about social sanctions, are they lessening or weakening over time? So for instance, are there quite a number of different types of sanctions at baseline, and then at inline those have contracted to become a smaller number or type? Do they get less severe over time? And or the influence of social sanctions? Next, are there more alternative non-normative behaviors perceived to be possible, but both possible and acceptable? And are there increases in exceptions when it's okay to deviate from the norm? So I showed you that exception. Are we seeing more exceptions, more instances where it's okay for a girl or other people to go against the norm? And so those are some of our analysis questions. And then finally, just a quick plug, I'd like to say a quick thanks to Lee Stefanik, who helped develop and pilot the SNAP framework in multiple different countries. And then just to offer up some resources, like I said, Emory University and ICDDRB in Bangladesh have been our research partners in the phase 2 baseline. And we've got all of our monitoring and evaluation tools posted on our website. I can send these links out as well. And then we've also got some innovation briefs that just tell you a little bit about how we design our activities from a social norms integration perspective. And then finally, it's not up there, but I can send it around. We have a social norms methods brief. So we use different social norms measurement tools and approaches during our phase 1 evaluation. We have briefs that describe that process in detail for you with links to the actual tools as well. And that's all for me. I will give up remote control.
Thank you, Anne, for that. I see we have many new people that have joined. I wanted to tell everybody that we were going to answer questions at the end. If you have questions as the sessions are ongoing, please put them in the chat box. Okay, Carrie, we're ready to hear from you.
Wonderful. So I'm happy to be following Anne Sprinkle because she did a wonderful job of really contextualizing the environment and the types of aspects that we're trying to measure when we work with social norm scales. So I'm Carrie Jo Clark. I'm associate professor at Rowland School of Public Health and am grateful to be collaborating with Anne on the phase 2 of the tipping point in Nepal. Today I'm going to describe a scale and the context of the scale development, one of which is featured on the Align platform in the toolkit. and use it as a place to sort of highlight some of the strengths and the weaknesses and the ongoing challenge and successes of, I would say, growing attempts to quantitatively measure social norms. All right, next slide. So I'm going to be talking about this within the context of a study that myself at Emory and colleagues at Equal Access International put forth as part of the What Works to Prevent Violence consortium that was funded by DFID or UK Aid and administered by the South African Medical Research Council. So this study was a cluster randomized trial, and we really wanted to understand changes in norms and experience of intimate partner violence. And we did this in 3 districts, and within those 3 districts, 36 communities in Nepal. In terms of the design, I'll just very briefly touch on it and happy to answer more questions later or point you to study publications. But it really was a repeat cross-sectional analysis at the community level over about 28 months of time. And we followed a quantitative cohort of 360 female listening and discussion group participants. And these were women who participated alongside with their husbands in gender separate groups, a detailed 9-month program where they listened to a radio program and did a series of activities in the groups and homework at home, and then worked together to do some community mobilization activities using street theater and a film and many other techniques. And I'm happy to talk about the programming later, but I really want to focus now on terms of the measurement. We also used qualitative and quantitative methods, a qualitative cohort of 18 of those couples, family members, and leaders, and radio listener feedback and a process evaluation to really help us understand how to measure norms and norms change. Next slide. So really reflecting back to Anne's description of the phase 1, I don't think I could overstate the importance of the sort of formative work, both qualitative and quantitative. And while the phase 1 for Tipping Point was quite long, many of us don't really have that luxury of that much time, but it is a critical piece to being able to really understand the drivers of the behavior. And in this case, we're looking at intimate partner violence and the different facets of norms and different types of norms and other characteristics, because it's not only norms that matter to this particular behavior. So in our particular case, there's a fair amount of literature on intimate partner violence that we had to work with. Lori Heisey and others have been working in this field for some time. So there was a fair amount for us to work with in trying to understand what are the different components and what are the different norms. We also did a lot of qualitative and quantitative piloting of different ways of understanding and trying to measure the norms. Next slide. So what we found was that there were not, at the time, there were different constructs in terms of empirical expectations, normative expectations, injunctive, etc. But we weren't finding scales that would allow us to truly tap into what we were trying to tap into. Some of our early efforts, and I have the scale up here, but behind this scale are early efforts at trying to measure attitudes and expectations. We found many of our respondents had difficulty differentiating the items. They complained that we were being redundant and taking a lot of their time, and that in a quantitative format, we did not have very good luck with vignettes, which are very, very strong methodology for qualitative. So we were struggling to try to understand how to differentiate attitudes versus expectations. And so one of the things that we did was try to pull together a scale that touched on the different facets of the norms that we wanted to tap into, with intimate partner violence being driven in large part by gender role expectations, but a number of other facets that I've already shown. Some of the things that we did here was, and this frankly was a little bit risky, excuse me, but we added something of the sanction into the items because we found it very difficult, as I mentioned, to really differentiate people's perceptions from their attitudes or help them to do that. And while I'll describe in a little bit, some of the risks with that, but with a fair amount of formative work, we were able to try to understand what the different reference groups were and the different sanctions that might be that might occur for violations of these different facets of the norm. For example, the first one, a husband who helps his wife with the household chores will not be respected by his family. So here we're really highlighting the reference group and the sanction in the same item. And while they're not all 100% exactly like that, because the format of the norm did not allow us to do that, it did help us to very successfully differentiate individual attitudes from this is basically injunctive norms. So while there is some risk here, I would say our ability to do that was because we had a lot of preliminary literature to work with and quantitative and qualitative experimentation to help us really understand reference groups and sanctions. Next slide. So we looked at this scale psychometrically because it was, one of the first ones to really tap into injunctive norms in a way that also clearly differentiated it from attitudes. And here, I won't go into great detail, but we see a 1 and a 2 factor model really standing out as both being quite good fits. The challenge with our particular scale with the number of items that we have is that if we shift into a 2-factor model framework for understanding this, the underlying norms, we really only have 2 items that are standing out, and they really have to do with household decision making and division of labor within the household. We have worked with this scale now in a number of different studies and found it to repeatedly function well, particularly as a single item scale. You see it has strong Cronbach's alpha, and we continue to use it in Nepal. Whether or not it should be expanded with a greater number of items, to possibly interrogate other factors is definitely an ongoing question for scale development as to whether or not we need to really bolster more of that decision-making and household deliberation and division of labor. We have chosen to keep it as a 1-factor score. We also kind of like the terseness of it because while norms are a key focus of what we're doing and we want to measure them precisely and accurately, we also understand with any particular behavior that we're working on that norms are an important piece, but not the only piece. So for all of us who have sort of long questionnaires, it is not just an academic whim, but more of the necessity of really understanding all the different facets that are interrelated and resulting in a particular behavior. Next slide. So we used this quantitatively in the trial data to really look at one other feature of thinking about norms measurement that stands out. And one is, theoretically driven. So where are the norms that you're trying to measure and trying to change? Individual perceptions? Are you looking at changing measures or facets at the community level? And so one of the features of this scale that we looked at is whether or not there's something in addition or different when we try to aggregate these measures up to community level. so that we looked at whether or not the norms as an individual perception was related to women's risk of intimate partner violence, but also what are sort of the prevailing conditions at the community level. And in this particular analysis, we found that both had a unique contribution to be made to women's risk of intimate partner violence. But the conceptualization of the norm that you are using and whether or not it's a community level feature or an individual level feature, I think most of us think that it's really the interaction of the two, this interplay between individual and the collective, which is leading our team to continue to try to innovate in how to measure both the individual expectation, but also the collective phenomena and how best to do that. Next slide, please. So some of the challenges with our attempt here at developing and validating the scale is, as I mentioned, the inclusion of the sanction in the reference group. It could be wrong. It could be wrong for some. Our formative work suggested that these were pretty straight on, but transplanting this to other districts or to other countries would need to reflect on whether or not the particular sanction or the reference group is most appropriate. They can be replaced rather easily, but wholesale, movement of this scale, I would say, it does require some fine tuning and at least some formative work to make sure that the reference groups and the sanctions make sense, or they need to be replaced. We also know that the norms reference group differ and may be more expansive for men. So research in a number of different settings have looked at men's and women's reference groups, their social networks, and they are a bit different. And our team is spending a lot of time right now on really trying to understand and differentiate these items. This particular scale was administered to women, and we felt that it accurately reflected their particular experiences. But if this were to be administered to men and women or adolescents and youth, obviously thinking of the reference groups and the social networks would be very important. So sensitivity to the norms for this particular project, despite having a lot of data, the sensitivity piece, as Anne mentioned, is a critical piece to really understand how you're changing and how things are changing. And so this piece is one that this scale by itself does not really tap into that. And I would say that is aspects of a questionnaire or a mix of qualitative and quantitative that would be very helpful to have. Again, in terms of conditional preferences, another aspect of norms that is used by some practitioners is not very well captured by this particular scale. So other aspects of a questionnaire or a qualitative quantitative mix. So this is really a particular nod to this next one is really a nod to things like the SNAP framework. So we have lots of qualitative data, pages and pages and pages of qualitative data. We did not start this, our affirmative work out with the SNAP framework or other much more intentional type of frameworks. But I would say that it's much harder to mine good qualitative data with a less intentional process compared to like the SNAP. And here again, as I already mentioned, the women, not the men. Do you want to switch to the last page, please? Great. So these are just some overall considerations of sort of the journey of measurement that we've gone on. Reference groups. I think you'll hear this repeatedly, that these can be different, they can be diverse, they can be local, they can be cross-boundary, and it's not always obvious. So this really understanding what the reference group for that particular behavior and the particular participant is critical. And our team is using a mixture of qual and quant measurement, including social networks, to really understand at the community level how these networks work and what are the reference groups for individuals. This next point that I already alluded to is the level and source of measurement. Are you interested in the individual or the collective? Is your data internal, or are you able to use external measures of collective behaviors or processes that I think is generally recommended when you're using sort of a multi-level framework? Are you looking at attitudes, perceptions, or behavior? And do you aggregate any of these up? So all of these different approaches have been tried to try to get at measures of and scales of social norms in a quantitative fashion. And there are strengths and limitations to all of them. One particular challenge with aggregation of measures to a level 2 is that often you end up reducing some of the variability, and those collective measures, those aggregations become highly correlated, making them difficult to be in the same model mathematically. So there are some additional mathematical considerations when you need to use internal measures. In terms of where we are using this measure to try to investigate change, we are just at the beginning of understanding how sensitive this particular measure, the Partner Violence Norm Scale, is to change. And we're investigating that within the trial data at the moment. It's looking pretty promising in terms of our ability to detect change over time. But those types of analyses and that type of replication is needed to really understand, are we able to identify change that is meaningful in a particular time frame that is also well measured? And that, I think, is an ongoing debate. And this last point, before I stop talking and just say thank you, is that our interventions can also change how individuals relate to our scale items. So this is a phenomenon that could happen with any particular types of scale, but really understanding how the measurement properties change over time in relation to the individuals that we're working with and the change processes that we're working with, because we can actually change how people respond to scales over time with our particular interventions. So this is a sticky issue that has some pretty sophisticated analyses behind it that may not be accessible to all, but it is definitely an issue we need to keep in mind when we're looking at evaluation or trial findings, and see that there is change. Is it change in the direction we expect or not expect? And how much of the intervention itself has played a part in how people interpret and respond to our scales. So I'll stop there and thank you all, and look forward to the next presentation.
Great, thank you very much, Carrie. That was really interesting. Thank you. If people joined late, just a reminder to put your questions in the chat box. So next we're going to have Saruchi from Drexel talking about his 2x2 social norms measurement approach.
Hello, everyone. Okay. Thank you so much for joining the webinar. And I'm planning to discuss the use of participatory research methods to measure social norms, specifically focusing on an innovative technique that I've been using for the past 7 years or so. And in the absence of a catchier title, I've been referring to these as the 2x2 tables for norm measurement. Next slide. So we all understand the importance of reference group, and both the previous presenters have talked about that, how important reference groups are vis-a-vis social norms. So as a precursor to undertaking the 2x2 table, we do a social network mapping activity. Essentially, we start with a social ecological framework, and participants fill out social network maps of individuals whose opinion on a given behavior are important to them. So this helps them concretely think about specific individuals when they are working on the 2x2 tables. Next slide. So the steps that we follow to do the social network maps involves, of course, explaining to participants that they are going to list all of the people whose opinions matter to them and or with whom they discuss a specific topic. We've often found it very useful to have facilitators go through a quick example that's unrelated to the research topic to get people thinking about this. And then we have the participants fill out a blank map individually or as a group with the facilitator, prompting them to think about individuals at all different levels. So individual level, family level, community level, friends, peers, etc. And then what we do is we follow up the filling of the map with specific probes to spark discussion. So for example, who are the barriers? Who are the allies? What are some of the specific issues you discuss? Are some issues harder to discuss than others, etc.? Why is that? Slide 4. So I want to show you one example of a social network map, which is displayed on the right-hand side of your screen. This is an example from a project in Uttar Pradesh, India, called Garima. And Garima is an SBCC initiative, or a social behavior change communication initiative, to address adequate menstrual health and hygiene management among adolescent girls in India. So after listing all the individuals across the 3 levels of the social ecological model whose opinion mattered to the adolescent girls, we asked them to list which one of these individuals were allies and who served as barriers. And those are the people that we circled in either red to identify barriers and green to identify allies. And also, given the multimedia efforts involved in this intervention, we added several other questions. For example, what are some of the other sources of information that they have? What are some of the specific topics about menstrual health and hygiene management that they discuss? So in a way, this activity, other than being a precursor to the 2x2 tables, actually was a standalone activity that helped us look at any changes in interpersonal communication, because that was one of the main objectives of this program. Next slide. So in terms of preparing for the 2x2 tables, we finished the social network maps, and these tables are designed specifically to assess whether social norms are at play and the reasons, social rewards, and sanctions behind them. Here, the participants identify which quadrant they fall into on 2 2x2 tables, one table for approval and one for behavioral expectations. This activity works better if it's done using large flip charts, so participants can visually see where they fall. And then they are asked to reflect on reasons, rewards, and sanctions for falling into each quadrant. Next slide. Okay, so the way we set this up is to give each participant 2 pieces of paper and ask them to note the answers to 2 dichotomous questions without revealing their answers. So the first question is, do you approve of behavior X? And the behavior here could be whatever issue that we are interested in studying. So for example, it could be abandoning FGM, it could be practicing open defecation, using sanitary pads instead of cloth, feeding colostrum, institutional delivery, girls completing secondary education. So all of these are behaviors that we can look at. Essentially, all we're looking at is, do you approve of whatever the behavior is? And they don't have to give us the answers, they just write it down on the little slip of paper we've given them. Then the participants are asked a second question. What about other people whose opinion matters to you? So all the people you listed on your social network map, do they approve of whatever the behavior is? And the participants are allowed to write yes or no on that piece of paper. We have done this with non-literate audiences, and so what we do is we give them green stickers and red stickers, so they can use red to mark no and green to mark yes. And once we've done this, we ask them to read out or show us the 2 words that they have written. So, for example, a person could say, I approve, and people whose opinion matters to me also approve of behavior X. So they would fall into quadrant 1. somebody else might say, I approve, but the people whose opinion matters to me do not approve. They would fall into quadrant 2. Or a third group of people could fall into quadrant 3, where they could say, I don't approve, but people whose opinion matters to me do approve of this behavior. And finally, people who say, I don't approve, and people whose opinion matters to me also do not approve of this behavior, they would fall into quadrant 4. So then we repeat the exact same process, but instead of approval, now we are talking about opinions. So people whose opinions matter to them, and also behavioral expectations. So the questions are, the people whose opinion matters to me approve of this behavior and, practice this behavior and also expect me to practice this behavior. In which case, if it's a yes, yes, it'll fall into quadrant 5. Or people whose opinion matters do behavior X, but they don't expect me to do the behavior, and they fall into quadrant 6. People whose opinion matters to me don't do the behavior. However, they do expect that of me. They would fall into quadrant 7. And finally, participants who say that people whose opinion matters to me don't do the behavior and don't expect me to do the behavior either fall into quadrant 8. Slide 7. Next slide. So here is an example. This is again from India. So the original tables we had were very hard to read. So I recreated those tables. And you will notice here that this data is from an FGD that involved 12 adolescent girls. And you will notice that there are differences between the tables when we're asking them about approval, the blue tables, versus when we're asking them about expectations and actual behaviors of others. These are the green table. And so we follow this up then with probing questions. Can you explain why you fell into X quadrant on approval, but you're falling into a different quadrant when it comes to behaviors and people's expectations of your behaviors? And we also then ask them why they fell into a particular quadrant. So what are some of the reasons that you're in this quadrant? And also, what are some of the rewards and what are some of the sanctions? Next slide. Right. So in terms of interpretation, let's say participants fall into the yes, yes or the no, no quadrants. What this signifies to us that norms are at play. Right? So because everybody approves of the behavior, everybody is doing the behavior, or nobody approves of the behavior and nobody is doing the behavior. And of course, depending on the behavior that we're talking about, this could be health promoting or it could be health harming. Dissonance between approval and practice illustrates that participants are either abiding by the norm that they would rather not, or they are challenging a norm that is widely practiced. We have also noticed that sometimes participants are unable to articulate reasons, social rewards, and or social punishments, which to us suggests that perhaps pluralistic ignorance is at play, or these norms that we are looking at are habitual. So they're part of, considered to be a part of religion, culture, or tradition. Next slide. So the fun thing about 2x2 tables is that they can be used at any point in time in the SPCC program cycle. So they can be used in the needs assessment as well as the monitoring and evaluation phases. During the needs assessment, it can help us understand if the behaviors that we're interested in are driven by social norms. So some earlier studies that I did indicated that open defecation was not necessarily a social norm. As part of the monitoring cycle, we can look at program inputs and outputs and also start measuring shifts in normative behaviors. And of course, as part of evaluation, we can examine the extent to which we have been able to move the needle vis-a-vis addressing norms. So from an evaluation perspective, we've used 2x2 tables using baseline end-line comparisons and also case control comparisons. So, there are different ways of using it. Next slide. Right. So far, I've been discussing the use of 2x2 tables primarily as a part of group discussion. But with some restructuring, I've also been able to use them during in-depth interviews with key informants. And honestly, comparing the responses among individual audiences or intended audiences for a program and key influentials for a program is really interesting. Also, we've used the questions in structured interviews. So for example, again, from the India study, we asked respondents the same questions about approval and about behavior. And then we use computers, because this is happening on as computer-assisted personal interviews. It helps us formulate the third question, which essentially says, you mentioned that you approve or disapprove, and or but other girls in your village approve or disapprove. And what can you give us the reasons for this answer? And then the reasons question is followed up by rewards and sanctions. So we get both qualitative as well as quantitative data. Next slide. And my last slide that I wanted to show you was, as I mentioned, that we've been using these tables for several years now. And apart from the project that I just described from India, where we looked at norms governing menstrual health and hygiene practices, we've also used these tables to look at social norms around abandonment and continuation of FGM in Ethiopia. And we currently have some fieldwork going on in Guinea. We've looked at discriminatory social norms through 2x2 tables towards children with disabilities in Macedonia. We've looked at social norms around child marriage in Bangladesh, and social norms governing key maternal and child health and child protection issues in Mozambique. So that's all from my end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Suruchi. And now we'll be moving into our last presentation. Vincent, take it away.
Thanks very much. Let me see if I have control. I should. Great. Thank you and good evening, everyone. I'm Vincent. I'm the regional advisor in the Middle East and North Africa for matters of social and behavior change for UNICEF. And today I'm going to talk about an ongoing monitoring initiative that we initiated in the Middle East and that later spread to other regions. The focus is going to be slightly different from the other presentations. I'm going to be talking about how to change corporate practices at a fairly large scale. So to give you a sense of why we're doing that and where things started, we surveyed about 20 country offices in the region a couple of years ago, and we asked them, among a long list of interventions, which ones were the most important to strengthen their work on violence against children and on harmful traditional practices. And as you can see, shifting social norms and values came on top of that. We then asked them a second question, which was the type of support that they would prefer to receive in the area of social norms. And we listed multiple things that you can see on the slide, and two came on top far ahead of the others, which are programming guidance, but importantly at the very top, support with monitoring. So that's the origin. These country requests are the origin of the work I'm going to present today. I want to start with a conceptual clarification to explain our focus. So let's take little Mohammed here who breaks a glass, and his dad loses it and starts yelling at him. So as with any negative behaviors, we need to understand why the person is acting the way he or she is. So I'll give you a few possibilities which come up frequently in our formative research here in the region. First, maybe his dad doesn't know how to discipline him differently. He might be lacking skills, he might be lacking confidence, but the result is that he acts violently. Or maybe this happens in public and there are other dads around. He wants to be seen as a good dad, so he does what he believes other fathers expect him to do. In other words, there's a social norm at play. Maybe also he genuinely thinks that the best dads are tough and that his kid will love him for it and grow as a better man. Maybe he lives in Hudeida or Gaza or Idlib, and as a dad, he's highly stressed and is not able to be in full control of his reactions. Maybe he's mad that Mohammed was cleaning the table in the first place, because that's a woman's job, and it kind of clashes with the gender roles that he's trying to teach, consciously or unconsciously. So there are gender norms at play. But so the chances are it's a combination of factors. It's been discussed before. Not one factor only will explain a behavior, and not they won't have similar importance as well. Behaviors are rarely, if never, explained by one thing, and the reasons behind them will differ from people to people and family to family for what looks like the same behavior at face value. So emphasizing what Kari said before on the criticality of formative research in that case. The point that I'm trying to make here is that our focus is not social norms in that case. At the end of the day, I'm not interested in shifting the norms which affect the violence as much as I am interested in ending violence itself. So the end result that I'm looking at is not the social norm, it's the behavior itself. And behaviors, even normative ones, are the results of multiple determinants. And it's been said, norms are one piece of the puzzle. Changing the norm might be the way to change the behavior or not. And both behaviors and the norms behind them can change as a result of a variety of things. So that's why our initiative started with establishing an account of the possible drivers of behaviors. So we classified the various things that can influence a person's decision in these three categories: psychology for all of the cognitive aspects, the sociology for the influence of the group, and that's where we would put the norms, and the environment for everything related to the context and the structural factors. And we conducted a review of and a synthesis of about 25 theories and models among the most recognized and tested approaches to human behavior to identify the concepts and the constructs that we would include in our efforts to develop some monitoring tools and guidance. The result of this analysis is presented in a document that is called the Behavioral Drivers Model, which you can download at this address if you're interested. I'll post it in the chat later. I'll ask the team to share the presentation. I don't have time to walk you through the theory, but I want to mention a couple of things so you understand the initiative. The model contains a standard behavioral pathway, which you can see on this slide, with the highest level drivers in the three categories mentioned before. So you see familiar constructs here, you see attitude, self-efficacy, intent, social influence. These are all things that you are all probably pretty familiar with. At the same time, the model unpacks each of these factors into a lower level dimension and all of the dimensions that compose them. So for example, considering that someone's self-efficacy is a combined result of her confidence, her skills, her self-image, her social mobility, and so on. So altogether, we give an account of about 130 behavioral drivers. So that's going to be important in a couple of slides. Now back to the monitoring challenge. The fact is that in most cases, we don't really capture the results of social and behavior change programming. Very often, social and behavior change monitoring is largely focused on the left part of that slide, which is process and activities. So my colleagues are very good usually at measuring campaigns conducted and leaflets distributed and how many people they have been reached and trained, but it doesn't really inform the effects of the work. Now, on the other end, on the right side, when we look at the prevalence of the issues, we look directly at the end result without assessing the multiple milestones to be achieved on the way to change. And a prevalence can actually be steady for years, even if good progress is made on the various drivers leading to that behavior, and especially when social norms are at play. So the elephant in the room, and I apologize for this icon, but I find it pretty funny. The elephant in the room in that case is that we're not really monitoring the change process. So as a result, during a program cycle, which is fairly short and usually much shorter than the time needed to shift the behaviors, we're not able to know and to show if we are moving the needles of the various drivers of the behavior, and that results in difficulties to keep the partners on board, and especially the donors in our case. So this discourse makes sense when I explain the logic to the colleagues, but I'm still facing resistance when trying to support them and change the practice. So the need for internal behavior change within our institutions is something fairly significant and that we discussed multiple times during the last Learning Collaborative gathering. So to make the shift easier, what we've done is that we've developed a monitoring toolkit. It includes banks of indicators and questions for each of the drivers that I've mentioned before, applied to 3 initially: FGM, child marriage, and child discipline. So the banks look like the top right image. They're basically long Excel sheets with indicators and questions matching all of the drivers of the model that I have briefly shown in the previous slides. It also includes pre-tested standard surveys ready to adapt to country contexts, and they're available in English, in Arabic, and French. So that's the screen capture at the bottom right image. So these surveys include vignettes for the questions related to social norms. They include question batteries for the gender norms, and they also include scales like 3 and 5 level scales, which means that we've embedded qualitative elements into a quantitative tool, which are going to be used in door-to-door surveys. The purpose is also to make it easier for the colleagues to build their monitoring frameworks, which is something they're really struggling with. So aligning with the structure of the model, the behavior in question would be considered the goal of the SBC program. The highest level of factors that I showed before, called the highest level of drivers, the factors would be the outcomes. Then the lowest level, when we unpack them, would be outputs or milestones to be achieved that we can measure and discuss with the partners and the donors. Activities are inputs, and everything contributes to impact. So that's the logic. And this is my last slide. It's to explain what we're doing today on the basis of these tools. So we are running a cross-regional initiative, which is a multi-country evidence generation exercise. And we are collecting monitoring baselines for the drivers of negative behaviors using the approach that I've just described. And at the same time, improving the tools with, I hope, the potential to create new standards at the corporate level. It's a joint initiative that internally we conduct between child protection, C4D, gender and monitoring and evaluation. We have 3 regions on board, and we operate in 9 countries. And we work with headquarters. We just started a contract with Ipsos and Oxford Policy Management to help us with implementation. It's a $2 million contract. I mentioned the price because some elements that we are conducting are fairly expensive, but at the same time, we try to have each survey rather cheap for the countries. And I know we're going to discuss the costs in the Q&A. The surveys are on 8 harmful normative practices. So we extended from 3 initial to 8. So now we're looking at FGM, violent discipline, child marriage, sexual violence, xenophobia, child labor, domestic violence, and feeding practices. And so we're identifying and measuring the drivers of these behaviors, which we can later track. So it's on top of this local programmatic objective in each country, which is getting concrete data for monitoring. We are running cognitive testing and validation studies to kind of scrutinize the tools and the conceptual basis and assess the level of reliability of the data we collect and our ability to capture the intended constructs from the model. I don't know if you are familiar with cognitive testing, but it's a fairly heavy process. It's a bit unprecedented for us because we are following standards to develop the surveys that are those of the MICS and DHS, and that are basically never applied to the development of the thousands of CAP studies that UNICEF invests in. So we are pretty excited, even though we're at the very beginning of the journey. And this happens on top of the central objective, which remains to open the black box of social and behavior change and renew the conversation with the partners. And thank you very much. someone took control again, so I can't show you the thank you slide, but it's not very interesting. Yes, it is thank you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, everybody. That was very, very interesting. Vincent, we have a slide. I'm going to go to you first. We just got this last question in. People loved your presentation, but would very much like you to share links, maybe in the chat box with
Sure.
materials. Yes, that'd be great. So I'm going to just start at the top. I think this was really interesting and really showed us reflected things across the program cycle like we had talked about. So I'm going to start with Carrie. I'm sorry, Anne, you had a couple questions off the bat. Here's a question for you. Has the SNAP been used to obtain data against any particular indicator? And is there any way or even need to quantify the results of your analysis?
Sure, yeah, thanks for the question. I would say, so in our phase 2 baseline, we have questions in our surveys on normative and empirical expectations, and those will be used for understanding change in expectations from baseline to endline, obviously. But I just really do want to underscore and emphasize that we find qual so much more useful than quantitative measures on norms. We have multiple different indicators that are supported by those survey pieces, but obviously those are supported and triangulated with the qualitative as well.
Great. There's another question for you as well, Anne. It says, is it possible that one could believe a norm exists, but it's not the case? The example given here is, I believe all my peers smoke, even though they actually don't. In this case, I believe smoking is a social norm that I feel I would be judged if I didn't participate, but the opposite is true.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks, Lee, in the chat box for mentioning we have a couple of different examples from other countries of the quant surveys as well. But yeah, for Kate's question, perceived norms are the actual norms, right? Like if there's agreement by the whole subgroup, that's the norm. But if they're wrong about what others do or what others approve of, then you can identify that using surveys that also measure individual attitudes like I was talking about, and then you correct that misperception, right? But this is pretty rare when it comes to gender norms, that people are actually wrong, that there's pluralistic ignorance.
Thank you for that. So Carrie, there was a few questions for you. And it seems to be a pretty specific question. One or two items in the IPV norms measure seem to ask about respondents' own views on acceptable behaviors, or didn't refer to a reference group. I wondered if these were all assessed together or if personal attitudes were measured separately.
So thank you for the items. So a couple of them, as I briefly alluded to, the reference group, we were concerned about being wrong, or it was not clear enough in our data to be able to specify that. So these were all measured, and the frame, which I didn't present the question, is the frame is really how many people in your community believe thus and such, and then the response options were on that one page, almost no one, some, most, or all. So the frame of the whole setup was really about thinking about how resonant these concepts are to people in your community. We did have a separate section on attitudes that were very typical, based in large part off the Gender Equitable Men's Scale, like is often done, and just keeping those placed in a way that makes sense. Preferably not making them totally contiguous in the survey also helps to keep them from being conflated.
I'm just wondering if it's normal that we can't hear anything right now.
Yes, I can hear you, Vincent, But if there are any questions being asked of us, I cannot hear that.
I can't either. This is Suruchi.
I'm trying to unmute Donna right now.
No.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about
Sorry
that.
about that. Technical difficulty. I think, can you please put the presentation back? We have another question for Carrie Jo about her scale, and this is from Betsy. Can you say more about your comment on that interventions may change how individuals relate to scale items? Is this more of an intuitive statement, or did you find any specific evidence of this in your project that you could share?
So we have recently gotten a grant from the National Institutes of Health, myself and Catherine Yount, and others at Emory. We will be investigating this specifically using particular methods. So I'll be able to formally answer your question because we'll be examining our trial findings in terms of measurement properties over time and also across conditions. If the control and intervention communities are, the measurement properties are the same, and the items correlate similarly or load similarly on these different techniques that we'll be using. So in about a year or so, we'll be able to answer that specifically for this trial and 2 other trials where we're looking at potential measurement non-invariance across scale items and settings. In terms of looking at whether or not people's perceptions change, so this is a general measurement property that is possible with almost any particular scale. So it's not unique to social norms or others, but it is a challenge in our field where we look at things like intimate partner violence or other things where there might be a greater potential to sort of shift perceptions of these particular items. There is the way to look at that, and other scales have undergone that. Those techniques, we have done less of it in the particular field of intimate partner violence and in the now more burgeoning measurement of social norms. So these items will be interrogated, and also the violence items will be interrogated across several trials. So apologies for not giving you an empirically definitive answer, but that legwork has literally just begun.
Okay, great. Our next question is for Suruchi. What elements of social networks are important in measuring changes of norms?
Okay, so what we've done is we look at several aspects of social networks. The way we've used social networks together with 2x2 tables is essentially to give people a sense of who those reference groups are that they're talking about, because we realize that if we just do 2x2 tables, it gets very confusing, and people like, when we say, oh, people whose opinion matters to you, they don't really know what we're talking about. So having the network map in front of them allows us to point to those people who the participants have actually told us about. And in addition to that, this is a really good question. Like I said, the network maps can be used as data in of themselves. And so we've looked at, for example, in India, our indicator was change in interpersonal communication at the family and the community level. And so by doing network maps every 6 months or so, we were able to actually track that indicator, because we could see that the conversations that these adolescent girls were having within their family networks and community networks were increasing over time. And the other thing we also looked at for the India data was also the quality and quantity of conversation. So what exactly were they discussing around menstrual health and hygiene management? Because there's so many behaviors that comprise the practice that we felt it was important to look at not just how many people they talk to, but also what they talk about. And the last thing we did with this was we also used the network maps as to measure social support, because we did ask them who are the barriers and who are the allies. And so we use that as a measure of social support. The important thing to remember is this was less a research activity and more a programmatic activity for us. So the project was done around girls groups, which met once a week. And we actually trained peer leaders to collect some of the data. So they could look at the map and they could then also among themselves figure out what actions do they need to take to convert some of the people they think are barriers into allies. So this wasn't something that it's more behavioral monitoring that's incorporated into program processes rather than bringing in outsiders to do the monitoring of the networks. Yep, that's it from my end. I hope that answers your question.
No, I think that was a really great answer. Thank you so much. I'm trying to give equal, I want to make sure everybody's questions across the presentations are given. So Vincent, there's a question for you. And it says, your survey is across several regions and countries. Are you modifying for different contexts? I assume the tools cover individual social norms and environmental factors as in your slide. Have you found the need that you need to adapt questions related to all these factors or only the ones related to social norms?
Yes, thank you. That's a great question. Yes, the short answer is yes, the tools cover all of the factors, and yes, we need to adapt them. Actually, adaptation to the context is probably the #1 priority. What we're trying to do is develop standard tools that can be of use to the, close to the 200 UNICEF offices that we have, but in a way that allows for the most local tailoring possible. So somebody already said that today. I mean, if there was one thing to be done for me, it's the qualitative part of the work. The quantitative is necessary for the reasons that I've mentioned, including for the relationship with a number of people who believe more in that type of monitoring. But really the qualitative aspect of the work, if there's one thing to be done, either to guide your programming or to guide your monitoring, that's probably the first and foremost thing. And actually in the process of adapting the surveys, we have started conducting in a couple of countries already some formative research where we do a combination of focus groups in which we run exercises like problem trees and ranking exercises, so that in each context we can start from this long list of drivers that we have in mind and understand what's going to be relevant to be measured very locally. So yes, and that applies to the 3 types of factors, whether they are cognitive, social, or structural. Lastly, interestingly enough, when we were developing the standard surveys, we worked with a range of countries. So for certain surveys, I was consulting with 7 or 8 countries at the same time to see what would be the overlap between what is of interest from countries that can be as different as Morocco and Yemen and like Iran. And I have to say that 80 to 85% of the constructs of interest were the same across the countries. But the tiny proportion of those that were different were very important and highly related to social norms.
Great. That's an interesting question. We're going to be running out of time quickly, so I'm going to take sort of the prerogative of the moderator. There's a question here that I've not heard a lot about that I'm going to ask, and this is for everyone. Any of the panelists can answer it. And the question is this: when conducting evaluation, how important is it to measure shifts in social norms among people in the community who are not a part of an intervention or a program effort, but part of the social community, so to speak? I find this to be a very interesting question.
I can kick us off. I'm sure other panelists have a lot to say, especially Carrie can talk about sampling as well. But in Tipping Point, we thought it was really important to understand community level perceptions because we want to see change beyond direct participants, to see community level change and shifts. And so we have multiple different strategies and activities to do that. And so we have a community level survey that doesn't just engage direct program participants, so mothers and fathers, but all parents or all community members of a certain age group. But, you know, to be honest, it's unlikely in project timeframes that we usually have to see a change, a big change at community level. So we want to do both. We also want to understand perhaps among participants how things may be getting started, and then also do some community level sampling and surveys and FGDs as well.
Yeah. I'm happy to jump in here as well. And I very much echo some of what Anne was saying there about sampling. It's very typical for us to measure as researchers the intense participants, but also try to get some semblance with the assumption of some diffusion or some impact beyond those most directly intervened with. And just to put a plug for the blog that this project has just, the learning community has just put out, speaks to this particular question about how do you measure change at the community level. And so in some cases, people do the random sampling at the community level. Then you really have to ask yourself, how big of this space? What is the size of this measurement frame that you anticipate being able to affect particularly with social and behavior change communication strategies or others that really try to move beyond an individual sort of target or audience member. And so some of the work that we found in some follow-on and some intensive work with the change trial that I presented the scale from is that trying to understand more who these networks are. Because when we do our random sampling of the community, we're assuming that we're going to reach all those individuals. But when we look much more deeply and at who are the reference group, who are the people with whom they are talking to about these issues that they're diffusing this information to, we find in this particular trial, we find a much more personally social closeness and geographic closeness in terms of the individuals that they are interacting with. So our particular team has shifted more towards trying to measure social networks and understanding those reference groups and within networks to understand who they speak to about these types of personal issues or challenges. There's lots of different ways to sort of get at it. And shifting a little bit more to trying to understand those networks so that we might be able to have more sensitive measures of the change and the knock-off effects or the knock-on effects of the intervention as it is intentionally being moved through those networks in more of an organized diffusion type of framework. So I think that's one of the shifts that we've taken as a team to try to measure the community level features, but be very specific about who we really think in that community will be impacted with a particular intervention and different types of activities.
Okay.
So I could jump in for a minute also. Definitely, the importance of social networks. And we have collected data in, for example, Ethiopia, where we are talking to adolescent girls and their primary caregiver, but then we're asking them who are the other people you talk to who are important. And we're interviewing those individuals as well. But one of the other things that I think this has helped us do, apart from just mapping people's networks, is also serve as an indicator for indirect exposure, right? So these are people who may not be participants in our interventions, but they have been exposed to the messages of our intervention based on interpersonal communication, let's say. And so for the India project, for example, we talked not just to the girls who were part of the clubs, but also comparison girls who were not a part of the club, just to get a sense of that diffusion process, if you will. So, certainly that's an important point.
I'm gonna end with one question, and I think it would be great if all the presenters could comment on this question. This is also a question from Lori Volieri. I'm working with 3 groups in Africa, East Africa, on social norms change interventions. All 3 have limited resources, which is troublesome to everybody. But we want to include M&E in their work. Would the panel comment on strategies to monitor shifts in social norms with limited resources and staff? Something that gives implementation organizations some direct guidance, something that would give the implementing organizations some feedback on the effectiveness of their interventions.
Sure, I'm happy to take a first stab at that, if that's okay. Hello?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yes. Yeah, that's a good question, because we're also working in a number of very small countries with very limited budgets, and budgets are already limited for social and behavior change programming. And so when it comes to monitoring the social and behavior change, we're really working with what we find at the bottom of the pockets, basically. The approach that we're taking in the case of the surveys that I've mentioned is to take the pulse of the results in a very limited number of small areas. So it's not seeking national representativeness at all. We leave that for the prevalence surveys, but when we are monitoring the drivers, which is again what we want to see shifting in the time frame that is reasonable for a program or a funding cycle, we actually select 2 or 3 hotspots where the program is going on. And all together, if you take a neighborhood of a city, a small village somewhere, and say a refugee camp, you end up having a sample of around 1,000 respondents. And what we saw across the board is that for a 45-minute questionnaire on one behavior, we ended up with an overall baseline that would cost about $100,000. I know that's still a significant effort, but that's the cheapest we could find. So it's just then making sure that the interpretation of the results is clear about what these things represent. So that's the approach that we've been taking. Otherwise, nationally representative surveys on issues like complex behaviors and normative behaviors would be much more expensive.
So if I could jump in on that question also, that's an incredibly important question. Like Vincent said, it's always going to be a question for us in terms of how much money do we have for monitoring and evaluation. And the approach that we've taken is to incorporate monitoring as much as possible into programmatic activities themselves. And so we are using data to monitor, but that data is also being used for a programmatic purpose to help design a program or implement a program. So for example, in India, the social network maps, the girls actually drew those maps in their clubs during their club meetings, and they used the maps as a way to figure out what their next strategy should or could be. And we also have done a program where we've had adolescent girls keep a diary, and we've added specific prompts into the diary. And then at a later point of time, we randomly select girls and go in and take a picture of their specific diary pages and then come back and analyze those pages. And so in this way, we're not separating the monitoring processes from the program processes, but trying our best to incorporate them so they work sort of seamlessly together. So that's how we sort of taken the challenge of how do you monitor and how much extra money do you need. And we do think about reliability. So what we've done is we've collected information from program staff, but at the same time, we've had a local research agency, somebody independent of the program, go in and do small validation checks. So they can, find out whether the information we're getting from our monitoring is reliable. Yeah.
Thank you so much. This has been really great for me, and I'm sure others on the phone. I wanted to remind everybody that The materials that we discussed about the Learning Club today are available on the Align platform, and that web link is here. Also, there will be a follow-up email to everybody who registered to have links to the information that was presented and the recording of the webinar itself. So thanks everybody for joining today. I know an hour and a half is a good chunk of everybody's time, but for me anyway, it was very much time well spent. And thank you to the panelists for giving us really great and thoughtful, rich presentations about their really good work. So this is the official end of the webinar for today.